You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Brooklyn, yo.
All right, friends. On a Thursday, it is the Locked On Nets podcast. Little quick live session here. Going to go for about 30 minutes. Obviously, draft coverage coming up later this evening for most teams around the league. Not the Brooklyn Nets, maybe the Brooklyn Nets. Depends on how things go here over the next handful of days. Obviously, next Wednesday, and the big news, Kyrie Irving, the offseason, the extension, the contract, the opt-in, the opt-out, the sign and trade, the walk away, all of those things on the line here, certainly. And we've got some more information, this time coming from the organizational side. As we always say, when you hear it from Shams, you're getting the player perspective or the player's narrative that they want to get out there. When you hear it from Woj, then you're hearing maybe some of the organizational pieces, and probably a little bit of both sides here when we talk about the latest information. So this is not, by the way, anything that, as you go back these last couple of weeks and having these discussions on the podcast, this isn't anything that I'm excited about. But I think this is the reason why you have these discussions around the what ifs and the possibilities, because here we are, maybe at that point where one of those terrible what ifs is on the way. So we'll get into it. I saw some people already up there, obviously in the chat, having some conversations. Feel free to throw out some thoughts. I'll start to get to those in a little bit. If you have questions or just, again, general frustrations, feel free, and we'll get some up on the screen here. But a little bit earlier, maybe within the last hour or so, you had Woj in Wojnarowski coming out with a handful of tweets that essentially outline a possibility that we are far closer to Kyrie Irving not being a Brooklyn Net than we are to an extension getting signed. And what does it mean, obviously, from there? There's actually an article up over, if you're an ESPN Plus member, you can go see some of the further details there. But we'll hit the gist of it here on an ESPN sources, as Woj quoted over on Twitter. If Kyrie Irving can't reach an agreement to stay with Brooklyn, he has a list of teams he'd like them to consider on sign and trades, including Lakers, Clippers, Knicks, Heat, Mavs, and 76ers. None of those teams have the cap space to sign without the Nets' help. So I think a big part of that feels like, because you're now seeing this expand a little bit, you're seeing the list of teams now get bigger than just saying, yeah, the Lakers would love to get him, which we talked about. Yeah, I'm sure the Lakers would, right? And that's a team that's desperate to win now. That's a team that had a terrible season by their own standards this past year. You have LeBron James, etc. And they want to come to the table with a $47 million player option for Russell Westbrook, something that Doug and I talked about the other day. The interesting piece now, just from that initial standpoint, is you're opening up options. Again, as Doug and I talked about, I'll reiterate, the best version of this Brooklyn Nets team is Kyrie Irving and Kevin Durant and Ben Simmons healthy, and a supporting cast they put around them, trying to win a championship over the next couple of seasons. But this is where we are right now. Now, the question becomes, we'll get to the Kevin Durant piece. That's the most important piece of this. But the question becomes is, what have behind closed doors been the conversations? Where has Kyrie Irving said that he wants to be as far as compensation? Is it flat out, as we talked with Chris Barnett from Hoop Spaces yesterday? Actually, the episode today, you can go check it out on YouTube. Is it flat out, I want to be a max contract player, max years, max dollars? That's the deal. There are no other paths forward. If that's the case, it can be somewhat cut and dry if Brooklyn is unwilling to do that. Right, wrong, and different if they're unwilling to do it. But if there's something just in the language of, or the minor stipulations, right, of saying, listen, it's not going to be the max dollars right now in this moment, but if you sign a shorter term max dollar deal right now, we'll come back to the table in another year, in 2 years, and continue to extend you and continue to get you paid. If Kyrie Irving is unwilling to do that, fully within his right, it's just very interesting to know what is happening behind the scenes here. What are these conversations that are going on between Kyrie and the team? That being the case, the other piece then becomes, is a Kevin Durant exit inevitable for Brooklyn? Because we're now talking about reports that Kevin Durant is, quote, monitoring what goes on with Kyrie Irving. Always a good sign. Always a good sign when you hear that coming out around something like this. For me, again, I had mentioned this before about how I think that there is a world. Again, not saying it's the ideal offseason here, but I think there's a world where Kyrie Irving is no longer a Brooklyn Net. Okay, deal with how that feels. Whether or not Sean Marks, Joseph Tsai, the entire organization is trash. Whether or not Kyrie Irving should have met them in the middle, whatever. If he's going to be gone, okay. Especially when you hear that there's these list of teams and you talk about the sign-in trade possibility for Kyrie Irving and for the Brooklyn Nets. Well, then you can be talking about getting assets back, talking about getting players back. None of these things. Actually, I love the phrase that Doug used the other day on the podcast: 4 quarters rarely equals $1, right? The singular talent that is Kyrie Irving, just because you get back a sum of parts doesn't mean that you're going to get there. If he walks away, I think there is the world where you can say, this is what we're getting back from Team X for him. It's not going to be a one-to-one. And here are the other moves we're going to make this offseason, or we're going to make over the first couple of months of the season. Like, I think Kevin Durant will be willing to see what happens, and it may be a razor-thin margin as to what he's willing to stay for, right? What has to be brought in to keep Kevin Durant on this team? Is it an automatic, hey, Kyrie Irving's gone, I'm gone, the Nets are back down to the studs? And obviously, from where we were just a few short seasons ago, this would be a pretty impressive burn down to the ground kind of scenario for them. But if you can keep Kevin Durant here, get returning compensation for Kyrie, and then I mentioned this on the conversation with Chris Barnett as well. Maybe the inevitable cutoff date is going to be the trade deadline in season, right? If you can go Sean Marks and ownership, Joe Tsai, to Kevin Durant and say, if you've at least given us the latitude to move forward with a Kyrie Irving sign and trade, and you tell us we have the summer and the beginning of the season to try to continue to build and improve this roster around you, and we think a healthy Ben Simmons, then we think we can get there. We think we can be a team that's competing early and maybe looking to add that one more key piece and put ourselves in a very strong position. Not as strong, but a very strong position this year, and hopefully getting stronger over the next season or two. And if it doesn't work out, Kevin Durant can call his shot as he approaches the trade deadline. The Brooklyn Nets will get more assets, and depressingly so, will be into much more of a rebuild mode. And then I wouldn't put it, and then I obviously wouldn't put it past either that then the next domino to fall would be to say, now you have Ben Simmons. How has he looked to start the year? Is he a tradable commodity? Would you keep him around with these talented players, etc., or go get more draft capital? You can look around the landscape, by the way, and then we'll get into some of the comments here. Because like I said, this is going to be, we'll go for about half hour here. You can look at teams around the league that aren't in major markets like New York or like LA, but teams like Oklahoma City, teams like the Houston Rockets, right? There's teams out there that have stockpiled draft capital, and it means absolutely nothing unless you capitalize on that capital. A little bit redundant there, but unless you turn those assets into a winning team, into a competitive team, it doesn't matter. So that is not that's not my one-to-one, everything's going to be all right if this doesn't work out because you'll be able to replenish all of your assets. No, the whole idea is being a team that can either draft and build up around a superstar talent that you acquire in the draft, or be a team that can build to a point to attract superstar talent and then go pursue championships. The Brooklyn Nets were able to execute on the latter route. And since that moment of achieving the goal of signing Kyrie Irving to land Kevin Durant, things have, for the most part, not gone remotely according to script. Over in the comments here, if we want, I'm going to scan through a few of them here. Yeah, here, this is like one of them too, just people that are throwing this out there as well. Yeah, I mean, listen, this is that kind of thing where you say if someone's open to it, right? If Kevin Durant's open to playing with Bradley Beal, yeah, I'd probably go for that. I don't probably go for that. I mean, hey, you pull the trigger on the thing that's going to make Kevin Durant happy. I don't know. Um, I don't know what that would look like necessarily. And again, when we talk about that initial tweet from Woj, which highlights who Kyrie Irving is putting on the list. Now, as we've said before, the Nets aren't obliged to only send him someplace that he wants to go, but because the leverage is saying, I can just walk out of here into free agency, forego 30 plus $1 million this year, and then wait for that bigger contract somewhere else. Obviously, Kyrie Irving can do that. And that's where the mechanics of sign and trade to get me to my preferred destination immediately, where I can have the max dollar contract and then go over to Team X. So when you see some of these lists of teams that they're putting out there, outside of the ones that were already talked about, Lakers, Clippers, and Knicks, the Heat, the Mavs were one that got thrown early in the day today. 76ers just seems like a weird one because there was already a problem between James Harden and Kyrie Irving this past season, it seems. So I wouldn't think that would be terribly ter- terribly likely. But hey, what was this one here? We had a question up there from Brendan. Will this create further tension in the organization? What, just this whole thing right now? Yeah. You know what, actually, one of the other things that I thought about too when we're talking about this is, um, so let's say that the perfect scenario is you re-sign Kyrie and you keep Kevin Durant here, etc. Um, what is the state of things going forward, right? On all sides, because okay, you did what was necessary and you're going to be here, but we went this drag out battle to get to that point. So on any side of it, Kyrie could be justified, Kevin Durant could be justified, the Nets could be justified. If things start to not go perfectly once you bring everybody back, now you have this little undercurrent of, well, they didn't automatically want to give me the maximum contract. Kevin Durant, now, Kevin Durant signed off on, well, if you end up moving them, okay, let's see what we do thereafter. And then you're going to bring these guys back in and say, now let's try to move forward and win a championship together. So this is about as messy of a scenario as you could possibly find yourself in if you're the Brooklyn Nets. And one other thing, too, as I'm just keeping my eye here over here. What culture are they trying to protect by not signing Kyrie? Oh yeah, the culture. I know that that's something that Sean Marks brought up in his end of the season, post end of the season, press conference. Um, yeah, it's a fancy word, right? It's a fancy word to encapsulate the idea of, we want, if you're an organization, we want to be able to feel like the thing that we chose to give up when we brought in the superstars, right? We want to feel like we have some control over our organization and over the expectations that we have for these players. You're not saving anything, right? I mean, you'll be back. Now listen, you'll be back. You can be back quickly to where you were pre-superstar mode, and that's not a better spot to be in. But the plucky team with the D'Angelo Russells and Spencer Dinwiddie's of the world that is popping up and trying to pop up in the playoffs, and then what do you go? Where do you build from there? Right? You have Cam Thomas on this roster. You'll have some other young talented players. I mean, listen, look at the landscape of the Eastern Conference, and you can kind of start to put them in the pecking order if they lose both of their stars this offseason. Hanging your hat on that is not going to win over any of the fan base. I'll tell you that right now. Hey, Brendan, what do you got here? What do you believe this will be solved in terms of days left before the deadline? Yeah, well, here's the other thing too that I'll say, Brendan. It's interesting to think about. There's two things. We talked about this with Barnett, hoop spaces on the last episode. We talked about over the last couple of weeks here when they led up to the deadline of choosing to push back, using that pick from Philadelphia at 23 in this year's draft, right? So I don't know if we're talking about resolving this scenario. If it is, hey, I'm out of here, it's over. Does that open up the draft night trade scenario where you can get more capital in this year's draft? That I don't know if that's more or less likely at this point. But again, if you want to talk about things, decisions that you're making, not having the draft capital inside of tonight's draft certainly impacts just some of the things that you may want to do, right? The sign and trade options, and you want to swap some picks around. Well, you don't have a lot of that capital right now in this moment. What players are coming back from any of these teams that you're talking about? What else? Who else in this draft class might you want to add if you're staring down the precipice of not having Kyrie Irving, and maybe internally knowing in the grand scheme of things by the deadline of the upcoming season, we're going to be out without potentially Kevin Durant, right? So things are getting done certainly a little bit out of order in that regard by the organization. Again, this is all speculation. It could all simply go right out the door when Kyrie Irving gets to a max extension. It's all posturing from both sides, and this won't matter anymore. But let's get Marcus. Marcus, you were up here a minute ago. We'll come back to you in a second here. I see. Oh, Joey BK86, who's been up in a lot of our YouTube conversations, obviously as well. We lose Kai, then we lose KD, and then we are. Thank you for editing your profanities there. I appreciate that. It allows me to get the comment up there. Right back in the lottery team, and actually worse than we were before. Yeah, no, listen, of course. Where this team will be is kind of is such a second, third, or 22nd down the list. It's inside of this moment of what's going to happen with Kyrie Irving and what does that mean for Kevin Durant. If Kevin Durant is willing to give the organization time to present, and I talked about this last week with Doug, I was like, what do I think is possibly going to happen? I thought this could be a real outcome for this team, and saying behind closed doors, we have gotten assurances from Kevin Durant that I will allow you to move on from Kyrie Irving and present your best version of this roster, and we will go forward from there. And if you're Sean Marks and Joe Tsai, if you're the organization and you believe that, well, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, 5 years ago, we were very capable of cultivating and building in talent. Now, how long is that runway of building up that talent? That's a whole other part of this. But if we think that we can go out onto the landscape with some TPEs and the returning draft capital and reform this roster and go towards this and say, here you go, Kevin Durant. This is what we have now in this moment, and we know we can continue to get better going forward over the next 6 months to a year. Here's our best presentation. Is that worth the risk of losing Kevin Durant and not just living with? And again, Kyrie Irving is an absolute elite talent on the court. So when I say living with or accepting the demands of Kyrie Irving in these contract negotiations, I want to be a max player on max years. If that's what it is, what is the percentage risk reward of Kevin Durant saying, I don't want to be here anymore, I'm ready to move on? We got Wilfredo Acevedo. No way I'm going to support this team. 2000, if to have this S would be wild. It's like fighting with your wife until you push it too far. I think S is almost at that point. We also got Pretty Tone. Marks can't replace his talent, so there's nothing he can present. No, yeah, but again, and this is the other part of it too. When we talk about, quote unquote, replacing Kyrie Irving, again, no one is going to match that talent outside. Listen, I mean, what are the scenarios you're talking about with some of these teams? What players could possibly be coming back and going and getting a Bradley Beal, who is not on the same, at their peak of their powers, is also not Kyrie Irving, in my opinion, but that idea of, can you get to the regular season with the roster that you're putting around Kevin Durant and start to get a sample size out there on the court and say, we're winning ball games. We can win games with you, Kevin Durant, and Cam Thomas, Kessler Edwards, Nicholas Claxton, Bruce Brown, Day'Ron Sharpe. And by the way, Ben Simmons, first and foremost list. And by the way, I don't know how much different is it going to look for all those other players, right? There was the reports around Nicholas Claxton and the Houston Rockets showing some interest in wanting to pursue him in free agency. There's Bruce Brown and whether or not he's going to command 17, 18, 19 million a year on the open market. If Kyrie Irving is gone, where is the value on retaining those players? We understand just because Kyrie Irving walks doesn't mean you're getting the dollar replacement. And if in a sign and trade, what are you getting back in and where do those pieces fit on the roster? So all of a sudden, you couldn't even begin to predict what the roster might look like and how much change we could see in a very short order from Sean Marks and the Nets to try to reconfigure around Kevin Durant. Try to get some other people up here who have been talking. Yeah, and listen, I'll bring up that point that you mentioned there. Pecan, nice. Um, sorry, catching names as we're rolling through here. Um, I know we all know that signing Kyrie Irving is what got Kevin Durant to Brooklyn. That is the way that the storyline and timeline played itself out. Um, but that's kind of my point about restructuring the team and selling Kevin Durant on, hey, you're Kevin Durant, and here is the collection of talent that we're putting in behind you, right? That I think is the way that you approach this if it were to go that route. And again, if Cam Thomas isn't the player that Kevin Durant wants alongside him, although you can look over this past year and say it looked like they had a really good relationship, and he's a dynamic playmaker and scorer, obviously, as we saw in these sample sizes. Go back to Summer League, go back to some of the big chances he got during the year. If he's the guy, great, and if he's not, well, we've already heard he's got first round value on the market and maybe a little bit extra. So things don't work here. It's officially over, and Kyrie's gone. Can you either go forward with Cam Thomas? Can you move him for player X in a package and the assets that you get back for Kyrie Irving? All these things are obviously a little bit further down the road here, but it all obviously starts with how Kevin Durant feels about what's happening right now. As we come back to that, monitoring what's going on. To your point here, pretty tone, you don't trade away all your future picks and then decide to self-destruct a year later. Well, no, obviously you don't. By the way, I don't think this wasn't the plan, right? And we have these discussions too. And this is a big thing that I do wonder, because Doug brought this up the other day about, look at it from Kyrie Irving's side, right? When you're coming to these negotiation table from the team side, hey, this year was tumultuous and you made a personal choice and that had an impact, and you weren't available and things fell apart and we had to trade Harden and all that stuff. And we look to you as saying there's some responsibility on your end for this, and that's reflected in the contract negotiations and what we're willing to offer you right now. Kyrie Irving looks back and goes, I was ready to play every single away game from day one, regardless of my personal choice. You guys kept me away. And only once things started to fall apart did you say, let's get him back in here and let's try to continue to win some ball games, right? So where that responsibility falls, what I wonder is, pre this past season, go back to last year, right? Kyrie Irving stepping away for a handful of stints over the course of the season. What impact did that have on the organization and how they felt about Kyrie Irving? While this past season may be the most recent and biggest moment that we think we look at in terms of that relationship, how were they feeling coming out of the year prior? That could be a lot of this as well, which would be interesting. And I'm sure we're going to get a lot of narratives, right? We're going to get a ton of narratives coming out of this around, if it were to come to pass, what went right, what went wrong, where did the Nets succeed, where did they fail, what is Kyrie Irving responsible for, what was Sean Marks doing, what is Steve Nash? See a lot of those comments in there about Steve Nash, right? What was his role in all of this and setting a successful table for these players to feel like the championship was there to be had and motivate anyone to make the best decisions for themselves and for the team overall and winning. Let's get Marks had weeks to sell KD on moving forward without Kyrie, and without a plan is a dead man. Marks dropped the ball on this. Could have replacements lined up. Well, yeah, and listen, but let's. I understand what you're saying. We don't know what the internal conversations are, right? I will say one thing. I will say is there is no world, I don't believe, that when we've talked about this, the Brooklyn Nets don't go into these negotiations with Kyrie and say, this is where we are, this is what we're comfortable with. It's already passed the smell test from Kevin Durant. Like in my opinion, it's already said, hey, this is how we're going to approach this, and this is what it could mean. Now we can ask the question, if you present this off-season possibility to Kevin Durant and he says, you do what you think is best for the organization, and this is what it could potentially mean for me and being a part of Brooklyn. As soon as Sean Marks, Joe Tsai, and the Nets get that information, they need to obviously act accordingly. If it is, you do what you think is best, but just know this increases the likelihood that I'm going to want out to about 85, 90%. Well, at that point, then it's on Sean Marks to go, so max contract for Kyrie Irving, that feels really good to us, right? So maybe there is some sense of what they were, option 1, 2, 3, all the way down to 30,000, if that's what it takes. You'd like to think that the Brooklyn Nets were approaching this offseason with a clear-cut understanding. The second that Sean Marks makes the statement in the end of the season press conference about, we want guys that want to be here. We want guys that are committed. Regardless of whether or not you think it's fair to point that at Kyrie Irving or otherwise, once he makes that statement, there damn well better have been a clear approach to how they were going to handle this offseason and all of the possible eventualities that could unfold around them. And I'm not saying trade Cam Thomas. We've talked about this in a lot of different iterations of this team. If you can go, and this is, you retain Kyrie Irving, you have Kevin Durant, you have Ben Simmons. Is Cam Thomas the perfect player to have there as the sixth man off the bench or whatever role you view him in? Or can he be used to go acquire player X to strengthen what the core of this team looks like? Or if Kyrie Irving is not here, now that would, you would think, open the door significantly more for what Cam Thomas is going to mean for this team going forward. But if you told me, whether it's Bradley Beal or player X out on the market, Portland already starting to turn their wheels on trying to reconstruct this thing around Dame Lillard. But if that was, hey, Cam Thomas and assets X gets you Dame Lillard, right? If you can use Cam Thomas to facilitate a move that gets in a player that satisfies Kevin Durant, that's all that I'm talking about when we say, who would you trade? How would you move? What would you be willing to do in these scenarios? Yeah, this is one that I actually, this is something that I've talked about going back to last season. That is, of course, hearing John Collins rumors. I personally was a massive fan of trying to pursue him when you start going back to hearing those rumblings around his desire to leave Atlanta. This was even if the Brooklyn Nets have Kyrie Irving back on this roster, this was one of those things when we talked about the possibilities of moving a Joe Harris or moving one of these other big financial commitments you have on the roster to try to build this team, make it stronger, make it better. I had walked through some trade machine scenarios involving, I'll try to remember who the third team was. It may have been the Chicago Bulls. When we were talking about, spoke with Hayes from Locked On Bulls and asked the questions around, hey, if we were willing to send, say, a Joe Harrison his $18 million and we want to get back a Kobe White who's fallen out of favor and had the injury, we want to maybe look at a Javonte Green and most importantly, getting back some assets in the mix there as well. Get some backup point guard with a little bit of length, get a versatile guy kind of in that mold of a Bruce Brown, and get capital back. But now if you expand that out and start to look at maybe the Atlanta possibilities and throw around a sign and trade that involves Nicholas Claxton, maybe that's to Chicago. You could look at pairing him down in Atlanta with Trae Young, and you start to move some of these pieces around. But listen, I don't want to get too far afield here on this. I like what John Collins obviously is. He has the perfect size, he has the perfect skill set, the perimeter shot, the defensive ability as well. That's a beautiful piece to add into the mix. But before we get a little bit out over our skis on it, let's see what happens. Now, this is a good one too, right? As we're rolling through this here, and we will probably put a button up on this pretty quickly here. But just wanted to hop in and listen, have the session, right? Have people vent about the frustrations, talk about how they'll be out on Brooklyn, obviously, if the Stars all walk away. But the Harden trade, you come back to this, and this was an interesting one too, where it was, now at the time, some people said, hey, we talked with Matt Brooks back then of, hey, listen, the trade to go get James Harden, and I'm going to go both of them, not just to Philly, but the trade for James Harden, where you give up all of those assets and there goes Jared Allen, et cetera. You look at it and you say, well, was that a panic move from the Nets around Kyrie Irving's availability 2 seasons ago? So you go and you make this move, and now the cupboard really is bare, and you don't have the opportunities to put in that supplemental talent and have some depth on this roster. Then you pivot forward, and because now Harden's dissatisfied, you move off of him. You think you have a talent, and at least at the worst case scenario, another asset to be able to trade in Ben Simmons. You obviously get Seth Curry. There's some short-term band-aids. There's some draft capital there. But the Harden overall arc is a funky one. And again, Doug would say 100 times out of 100, you make that trade in that moment. The one thing we can't do is look at that trade now and everything that happened since and say, well, that's why it was bad then to make that decision. So that's certainly a part of it. Doug would do. We talked about at one point. I can't remember. I can't remember if this was around when Harden wanted out. What it was, but just I think we're projecting towards this offseason of would you do a trade? I can't remember what the mechanics were, but for Rudy Gobert, I don't know. I've never been a huge fan, and this may have been pre Ben Simmons, or maybe that is what it was. Ben Simmons for Rudy Gobert is probably some conversation that went on there. I don't know. I don't know. It's an interesting one. I think obviously has a certain tremendous skill set to point X, but I don't know if you're talking about, post Kyrie Irving era, I don't know what that looks like. That's a hard one for me. Yeah. I would need to look and massage and think about that. A John Collins scenario for some reason, I like that opportunity. I don't know. And part of the Rudy Gobert one is probably age as well. Now we're talking about tight window. Kevin Durant wanted to win championships. So that part of it probably goes out the window. Just to bring up here. Yeah. Yeah. And I think, and this is what we talk about. You always make the trade. And then when it doesn't work out, you go, yeah, but you swing. You take the swing 1,000 times out of 1,000. And the fact that you don't hit the home run with it ultimately, yeah, but that's all that you can do. Otherwise you don't sign Kyrie Irving, right? We don't sign Kyrie Irving because we're uncertain if it means Kevin Durant will truly come. So we don't bother signing Kyrie Irving. We pursue Kevin Durant outright, and he chooses not to come to Brooklyn. What does that mean, right? Every fan of the Brooklyn Nets would be looking and saying, okay, you're telling me you didn't sign you didn't get Kevin Durant because you chose not to sign Kyrie Irving, right? I mean, we want to look back at it, go back to that point and say, should they have pursued Kyrie Irving? And that's why the revisionist, it's not even revisionist history, but just going back and relitigating those things are so difficult because now you have the sample size and you have this 3-year stretch and everything that's gone on. Oh yeah. No, well, so you're saying, you wouldn't even bother. You'd be out on going to games, buying the swag, supporting the team. I feel you on that. Yes, you had a squad before Harden came, but it was not. It was, and then this again. I'll briefly on this. I'm just going to re-summarize, and we'll get out of here. But that was not a champion. That was not going to be a championship team in that moment. What Jared Allen, has gone on to become is fantastic. We saw some sparks from Spencer Dinwiddie with the Dallas Mavericks, obviously in the playoffs. Karis hurt. There's a lot of uproar about losing him. That hasn't mattered. Spencer Dinwiddie, in the grand scheme, has not mattered. The Jared Allen piece, obviously, the draft capital, we get that. But I don't know. Again, if I can go back and watch that season play itself out without any James Harden and those pieces here, it'd be fun. And I'm someone who has always been a fan of the young players, the developed talent, right? So there's going to be ups, there's going to be swings and misses. There's going to be mistakes here, and that's a part of this too. It's not a 1-to-1 that Sean Marks has done everything perfectly and got Kyrie and got Kevin Durant, and this is all about the players. It's all about Kyrie Irving. No. Every organization makes missteps. Now, and again, I'll touch back to that Chris Barnett conversation, though. There are certain things that the organization has done, regardless of the superstars, the signings, the trades, etc., that fundamentally make it harder to move forward. To look too far past what Golden State accomplished. Now, they ended up absolute dumpster team without them high draft capital, but they were able to figure out a way to build and cultivate and coach up some of the younger talent to get themselves right back up here behind Curry and Draymond and a still recovering Klay Thompson. Maybe the Brooklyn Nets are at that point right now. When we talk about Kessler Edwards and Cam Thomas and Day'Ron Sharpe, right? Maybe we're about to see a leap from some of this young talent that shifts how we view this team with Kevin Durant and with Kyrie Irving going forward, with Kevin Durant and no Kyrie. And while the bar comes way, 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 way down, without either of these stars on this team, it'd be interesting. But as we said on the podcast before, like I'm a lifelong Brooklyn Nets fan. a New Jersey Nets fan. So I'm always in support of the not in support, I'm not saying in support of ownership, but I'm always in support of the team, right? I don't have player allegiance. I have team allegiance. I want to see the team do well. I want to see the best players be on this team, and I want to see them win championships. So if this whole thing falls apart into an enormous dumpster fire, well, I'm going to wait for them to put out that fire, clear away the ash and rubble, and start putting some blocks back in place to have some success going forward. Like that immediately where I'm going to go. It's going to go immediately into, okay, what's next for this team? How do they continue to build themselves up? That's the nature of it. I mean, I think that's at least for me, that's the nature of being a fan of a team is you want them to do everything right. You want the superstar talents and you want the championships. And if it doesn't work, if it falls apart, if they mess up, if they make mistakes, you go, gosh, get it together. All right, now let's see if you get it together. That's always been my mentality around those types of things. So just to put a button on this, because I knew I was going to go more than the 30 minutes. Yeah, and I'll throw this up there. How many times does it have to happen? I get it, but I'll frame it this way because I reference those teams, and they're not major market teams, but Oklahoma City and the Houston Rockets, who did have Harden at a point. All these other teams that have had massive draft capital and are trying to try and build up talent, trying to get to a point. They've never gotten to a point where they've been able to bring in superstar talent, right? I mean, how many times? Until it works. And I don't mean that it has to always be the buildup and attracting superstar talent. Just you try until it works, until you think that you're getting it right. And by the way, while we talk about the Billy King era and we talk about the Prokhorov ownership era, and now we talk about the Joe Tsai and Sean Marks era, this was the first big swing with the superstars for Sean Marks and Joe Tsai. What are they taking away from this experience? However it ends up shaking out. How will that impact what they do going forward and the decisions that they make as an organization? We'll have to wait and see. J. Kidd, listen, everyone knows a good Jason Kidd story, including the disastrous start to his coaching career that has turned itself around. Look at him now in Dallas, right? But bottom line being, and it may very well just be all talk. Rob Julius, killer YouTube photo. Sharp. Yeah, they may all just be that. And by the middle of next week, Wednesday's the deadline. Whatever the contract, max dollars, 3 years, 2 years, 4 years, whatever it is. Kyrie's back, Kevin Durant's still here, and we move forward with them and Ben Simmons and some of these pieces, and we see what it looks like, right? So that's the way that it goes. Yeah, well, listen. It's all to be determined. Bottom line is, as we know, more Wojn's information came out today, breaking down, obviously, that's what we talk about at the top here, that if they reach an impasse, Kyrie Irving has provided a list of sign-and-trade teams that he would consider, which would include the Lakers, Clippers, and Knicks, which were mentioned earlier in this week. They also throw in the Mavs, that came out earlier today, and the 76ers. In my hierarchy, which we talked about with Doug, I think the Clippers offer a very attractive sign-and-trade package in terms of the talent they have on their roster. The Mavericks would open up a very interesting door there, certainly, too. Because hey, if you wanted Spencer Dinwiddie, who knows? Maybe you can find him back on this roster. Though some discussion, I think that he and Kevin Durant didn't necessarily get along over the course of his time. But there's an opportunity there. You know that a guy like Mark Cuban is going to be willing to spend the dollars to get that job done. And just listen, you got to wait and see how it plays itself out. But at the very least, one thing we'll do, assuming that nothing happens here seismically over the next 24 hours or so, Doug will be putting out an episode tomorrow. It's not necessarily going to be about this stuff specific because this is kind of a rolling timeline here today. Over the weekend, I'll come in and we'll walk through a lot of these teams and just say what are the best scenarios in a sign and trade situation for these teams, the players you can get back. You look out at Dallas, we're talking about teams that want to pursue Jalen Brunson on the open market. Does that all of a sudden become a component of a sign and trade that activates that discussion there? The Clippers have some ones we talk about, Luke Kennard, and then maybe off of that, Terrence Mann, you start. Actually, one of the guys even think about too. There's a couple other names out there that we could talk about as well. But you start to think about just what are the packages you're getting back, and then what additional work would the Brooklyn Nets have to do from there to feel like you've strengthened the roster, made it much deeper, if not top end as talented, behind Kevin Durant to showcase to him that you can win going forward? So I'll do some of that bonus content over the weekend. But for now, we wait and see. I'll ask the question to the room right before we get out of here, though. If it is not a possibility for Kyrie Irving to be here, would you prefer that the sign and trade happens right now and you get draft capital in this year's draft tonight? Or would you prefer to see the draft play itself out, see where some of the other pieces fall around the NBA landscape, and then say, well, where is that perfect landing spot? Some of the risk I think you run here, and I forget who mentioned it, my apologies, about if you knew this was coming, could you have made a decision sooner on this timeline? One of the things you could end up having happen is just what happens in the draft impacting the number of teams that are interested in engaging in conversations around sign and trade for Kyrie Irving. But depending on who drafts who, that can all of a sudden open up another asset. Say, yeah, that young player that you took at 19, we'll go ahead and take him along with capital, etc. Or the Brooklyn Nets dictating terms to some of these teams. If there is a sign and trade looming, we would like to see player X coming back, and having that conversation would certainly be one of those things that could be going on as well. I'll just say, he said, yeah, I mean, I would be looking at, you mentioned Luke in there. Well, I'll get into it over the weekend. I'm gonna spiral. I'll end up spiral. We could go down a rabbit hole here, friends. I appreciate everybody that came in on the live one. We said that we wanted to do more of these over the course of the off season. We've been shuffling a lot of things around. Some of it's just been caught in the muck and mire of what has not been a very fun discussion in these past couple of months around the what ifs and the possibilities of these scenarios. But we'll try to dial up some of these lives because I like getting in with everybody, having these conversations, and feeling like you guys are here, getting your voice heard. And finding out what's possible for the Brooklyn Nets. We'll continue to monitor it. Obviously, you can follow myself at Adam Armbrecht over on Twitter, the show podcast at Locked On Nets, Doug Norrie over on Twitter as well. We'll see what happens over the course of the draft night tonight and then get into the weekend. Other than that, as it stands right now, I would say over the past 2 weeks, things feel like they are getting further away from Kyrie Irving staying than they were 2-3 weeks ago. Maybe it turns out to all be posturing, and we're going to go forward with a very contentious relationship between players and ownership as the Nets continue to try to build themselves into a contender that can win a championship. We will be back in on tomorrow with Doug on the podcast, and then over on Monday we'll be back in. And again, over the weekend, you'll see some alerts. We'll try to post up some comments over on the YouTube message board as well to let you know when we'll get back in on it. Thanks to everybody that came in. Brendan and Eric also in here as well. Marcus getting in on the conversation. Michael, Rod, King coming in there too. Everybody that got in. Pimp made name slip back. I gotta try to get everybody in here. Everybody. Miles coming in the room as well. Wilfredo, thank you for getting in. Tugger coming in here too. Brendan coming in here too. Thank you so much for being a part of it here. Enjoy the draft tonight. Even I know the Nets don't have any picks, man, but there's still a lot of fun and excitement if you're just a fan of the NBA. Go enjoy that. Take your time with what could happen for the Brooklyn Nets. And all right, fine. We'll do this right here. We'll give Afro, who just hopped in here, 3-team trade. Nets get Donovan Mitchell, John Collins. Atlanta receives Kevin Durant and Alexander Walker. Utah receives Gallinari, Bogdanovich. Of course, picks would be included. Oh, this is the Kyrie Irving is gone and Kevin Durant is also in the trade. Hey, let's not get there just yet. Let's take this one painful pill at a time before we go all the way down to the exit of one Kevin Durant. All right, that's going to do it for us. Thanks again for coming out on the action. As you know, we will be back in all throughout the offseason talking all things Brooklyn Nets basketball.